Australians will soon have the right to disconnect. The laws are changing in Australia as of August 26. But what will it shift? Will it shift the work culture? And what does this mean for leaders and managers in terms of changing the way that they operate and lead their team? Now, I think in Australia, we do have different working culture. It is quite different. I remember years ago when I was working in the film industry, I was working on a production. It was a German production and it was a mini-series. And back then, when overseas companies were filming on location in Australia, the law required that they had a 50% Australian crew and 50% of their own international crew. Now, what was really interesting about that is that there was industrial relation that occurred on the set of that production because the working culture was quite different. Back then, there were strict rules in place in terms of how many hours you could work, how many hours you worked outside, how many hours between breaks, all of those things. Whereas those kind of laws did not occur in the film industry within Germany. So basically, the producers said, oh, Australians are so soft, you know. In Germany, when we're working on a film shoot, you work really hard until you get the thing done. And if you don't do it, there'll be someone right behind you who will. So I think Australians have always had a fair go kind of attitude when it's come to workplace rights and culture. Now, back in 1856, the Victorian stonemasons won a world first fight demanding that they work no more than 8 hours a day. It was Australians that implemented the 8-hour workday. But things have changed. Things have changed in terms of workplace culture and expectations. And I think the research is showing that many Australians are at high risk of work addiction, and our work-life balance is worse than many other countries. And that's what the research is showing us. I think the reason this has occurred is because new digital tools that were supposed to help us do our job better have actually made things worse. It's backfired. We've created a culture where it is the norm to be constantly contactable. And I think a lot of Australians do have a hard-working culture. They've been brought up on that kind of culture. So we've just created this culture where we're constantly contactable. So as I said, from August 26th, the right to disconnect laws will apply to businesses with 15 or more employees. This means that your team members, if you're a manager or a leader, your team are no longer required to monitor, read, or respond to your communication outside of work hours. Now, this is going to have a massive impact, particularly for some of those leaders or supervisors or CEOs that are expected to be on call for emergencies or things that are going to occur. They need to be available to crisis manage. And so what comes into question is about what is considered reasonable in terms of that outside contact time and what's considered emergency. A 2023 study by the Centre for Future Work at the Australian Institute estimated Australian workers were on average doing an extra 5.4 hours a week. Now that amounts to 280 hours of unpaid time each year at a cost of 130 billion in annual lost incomes. That's how much we are giving and donating to our work, to our employer or to our business. So having this law is not going to fix things overnight. This is about changing the workplace culture, leading by example and setting a precedent. Now, I'll give you an example. I did a women in leadership training earlier on this year, and we're talking about creating that culture. And one of the leaders in the room quite proudly declared how they insisted that their staff take their lunch breaks, that they take time for themselves and have a lunch break. And when I asked this leader if they too took lunch breaks for themselves, they quite sheepishly bowed their head and admitted that they didn't take lunch breaks and worked through their lunch break. So it comes down to, leading by example and being the change that you want to see in the world around you. So individuals also need to set their own boundaries, and that can start by turning off notifications and maybe even taking work emails off your phone, setting parameters about when you look at things and when you don't. And for me personally, I set an alarm where I turn things off. It's at this point, at this time at night where I stop, and I no longer engage with any of those materials or respond to emails or messages. People are needing recovery time. We know that in terms of a physiological response. For us to be resilient, to not burn out, and to have stamina, as a machine, our engine needs to cool down. So now what's really interesting is these laws send a message to the working world of Australia that we need to disconnect more. But whether or not that's enforced, well, that's what we're going to have to see, but it will come down to creating a culture and implementing a culture that supports these laws. So if you need some support, advice or direction on how you personally can implement some healthy boundaries to build your resilience, manage your stress, prevent burnout, or if you want to look at how you can support your team or create a culture of that within your workplace, then please reach out, send me a message or comment below.